I'm going to ask you some questions about your background. You understand? You're from Baltimore. You grew up in Baltimore. Your family's from Baltimore. You lived in Baltimore your whole life. You're not from the rich part of Baltimore. You're not from the fashionable part of Baltimore. You're from the poor part of Baltimore. You're from the neighborhood that the police don't want to go. You're from the neighborhood where people don't trust the police, where people don't call the police when there's a problem, when people don't expect the police to look out for their best interests. That's where you're from. I want to ask you some questions about your family. You understand? You have a father, you have a mother, and you have your mother's parents. You don't live with your father. You haven't lived with your father for years. Your father hasn't been able to support your family financially for years. He's had problems with drugs, and he's been in prison. He doesn't have a full-time job. He hasn't had a full-time job in years. He doesn't have a part-time job. He hasn't had a part-time job in years. You do live with your mother, and you've lived with your mother your whole life. Your mother doesn't have a full-time job. She doesn't have a part-time job. She hasn't had a full-time job in years. She hasn't had a part-time job in years. You live with your grandfather. He doesn't have a full-time job. He doesn't have a part-time job. He hasn't had a full-time job in years. He hasn't had a part-time job in years. And you also live with your grandmother. She doesn't have a full-time job. She doesn't have a part-time job. She hasn't had a full-time job in years. She hasn't had a part-time job in years. There's one person in your household that does have a job, has a full-time job, has more than one full-time job, has had as many as 3 full-time jobs at a time, and has been working like this for years. That's you. Yours is the only paycheck that's coming into that house every month. Your money is putting food on the table. Your money is keeping the heat on. Your money is keeping the lights on. Your money is keeping the water on. Your money pays for health care. Your money pays for clothes. Your money pays for it all. You're the sole breadwinner in your family. There isn't money coming in from your father, from your mother, from your grandfather, from your grandmother. And there isn't money coming in from extended family. If you can't bring money into that household, it can't survive. There isn't food on the table. There isn't clothes on people's backs. There isn't a life for them. I want to ask you some questions about Stephanie. You understand? Stephanie's your girlfriend. You're in love with Stephanie. You've loved her for years. She's the only serious girlfriend you've ever had. You've gone out with her since 7th grade. And before that, she was going out with Adnan. And we'll talk about Adnan later. I want to ask you some questions about Stephanie's family. You understand? Stephanie's family doesn't live in the same neighborhood as you. They live in a different neighborhood in Baltimore. They live in a better neighborhood in Baltimore. And Stephanie's family's different than yours in a lot of ways. You'll agree with that. Fair to say she's got 2 parents. They both work. They both have full-time jobs. They both have good full-time jobs. And they both had full-time jobs for years. Stephanie has older siblings. You know them. They're all successful, fair to say. You'll agree with me that Stephanie's family, scratch that. You'll agree with me that Stephanie's parents don't want Stephanie with you. They'd want her with someone else. Someone from with a different background. Someone more successful. Someone with more of a plan. Someone else. And you don't spend holidays over at Stephanie's house. You don't spend Christmas there, Thanksgiving, or Easter. They'd rather Stephanie be with someone else. They don't want her to marry you. They don't want her to live with you. They don't want her to spend more of her life with you. And Stephanie, she's an impressive girl. She's an athlete. She's a scholar. And she's going off to college in the fall. You're not going off to college in the fall. You don't have a grand plan for your life. And that's a real problem in your relationship with Stephanie. I'm going to ask you some questions about Adnan. You understand? You've known Adnan since 7th grade. You've never been close friends with him. At most, acquaintances. And for a lot of that time, you didn't even hang out with him. Now, Adnan's from another part of town. He's from another neighborhood than you. He's from a better neighborhood than you. You know what the Magnet program is. It's a special program at Woodlawn High School for students that are especially gifted. Adnan's in that program. Stephanie's in that program. Heyman Lee was in that program. You've never been in that program. As far as you know, the only time Adnan's come to your neighborhood was when he was with you. And you've never gone to his neighborhood unless you're with him. Adnan doesn't spend holidays at your house, and you don't spend holidays at his house. In fact, you've never been inside his house. You've never met his parents, and Adnan's never met your family. I want to ask you some questions about crime in Baltimore. You understand? Fair to say there's a lot of crime in your neighborhood. There has been for a long time. You grew up around the crime in your neighborhood. You've seen violence. You've seen theft. You've seen robbery. You've seen drug dealing. You've seen a lot. And in your neighborhood, when someone sees that kind of activity, the first thing that's done is not to call the police. You've never called the police when you've seen a crime going on. That's just not how you operate. Someone could be shooting at you and you wouldn't call the police. You know what snitching is. A snitch is someone who tells law enforcement about someone else's criminal wrongdoing. Sometimes the snitch is lying. Sometimes the snitch is telling the truth. Where you're from, snitches are not looked upon kindly. They're not looked upon kindly if they're lying. They're not looked upon kindly if they're telling the truth. Bad things happen to snitches where you're from. They die. They get beat up. They get ostracized. They get hated. You're not a snitch. You've never wanted to be a snitch. That's not how you operate. I'm going to ask you some questions about law enforcement. You understand? You've had some interactions with police over the years. They haven't been positive. You feel like you've been harassed by police. You've been stopped by police. You've been kept out of your house by police in the cold for no reason. That's your experience with police. They're not the people you call when you have a problem. And that attitude is common in your neighborhood. That's how things are there. I'm going to ask you some questions about your work. You understand? In your time in high school till now, you've worked a lot of jobs. You've worked one full-time job, 2 full-time jobs, sometimes 3 full-time jobs at the same time. You've worked at H&M, and you worked at an adult bookstore. Now that adult bookstore sells pornography. Not your ideal job. Not the type of place you'd like to take your family. Not the type of place you'd like to take Stephanie. If it was up to you, you'd work somewhere else. That's not where you want to work at all. And you took that job in late January 1999. And you took it because you needed the money. And you took it because it paid more than other jobs. You worked a night shift there most of the time. Only once or twice did you ever work days. There was more going on at that adult bookstore than just selling pornography. There was sex going on, sex being sold. There was violence. There was criminality. You saw things there you wish you could unsee. You heard things there you wish you could unhear. You smelled things there you wish you could unsmell. You took that job because you needed the money. I'm going to ask you some questions about cars. You understand? Today, as you sit here, you have a car. In late January 1999, you didn't have a car. You'd never had a car. You didn't have a prospect of having a car. You didn't have a motorcycle. You didn't have a moped. You didn't have anything with a motor in it. If you wanted to drive somewhere, you could get a ride with someone. You could borrow someone's car. You could take the bus. That was the only way you could get around. At that time, you had more than one job. And you'll agree with me, you're also selling pot. You've sold pot for a number of years. It's one way that you've made money for your family. Now, you know a lot of people around your neighborhood. You know a lot of people who sell pot. And you also know people who sell pot and have regular jobs. Fair to say, there's nobody you know that sells pot and works more than one full-time job at the same time and doesn't have a car. You didn't have a car because the money you were making went to your family. You know who Coach Brown is. A coach at Woodlawn High School. He had a motorcycle, a Suzuki. He had that Suzuki for sale. You liked the Suzuki. You wanted the Suzuki. But in late January 1999, you couldn't afford the Suzuki. It's for sale for about $3,000. You didn't have $3,000. You didn't have $1,000. You didn't have $500. And you didn't have anybody that was going to give you money to get a car. No one in your family was going to give you money to get a car. Stephanie wasn't going to give you money to get a car. Your very good friend Jen Pusateri wasn't going to give you money to get a car. Adnan wasn't going to give you money to get a car. That money had to come from somewhere else. I'm going to ask you some questions about pagers. You understand? In late 1999, you didn't have a pager. Late January 1999. Scratch that. You were selling pot. You were working more than one full-time job. Fair to say, you don't know anybody selling pot and working more than one full-time job that doesn't have a pager. You didn't have a pager because the money you made went to your family. I'm going to ask you some questions about your contact with the police in connection with this case. You understand? Fair to say, in your life, you've never sought out the attention of police. Whenever possible, you've avoided the attention of the police. And until late January 1999, you didn't have a criminal record. You'd never been to juvenile hall. You'd never been to jail. You've never been to prison. You'd never been arrested. But in January, on January 27th, 1999, that changed. You did have a run-in with the police, and it didn't go well. One moment, Your Honor. You were charged with disorderly conduct in resisting arrest. That's a fancy way of saying that you and the cops went at it. You were driving along, minding your own business, with your very good friend Jen in the car with you. And you were driving, and you see lights in your rearview mirror. You weren't pleased. Said something like, "Aw, snap." And you then heard sirens behind you. Things were getting worse. But you kept driving, and then you heard a voice through the loudspeaker. Police officer told you to pull over. You pulled over. You were in the car. A police officer came to the car. he shined a flashlight in the car, right in your face. He started talking to you. You started talking to him. He raised his voice. You raised your voice. Jen raised her voice. And pretty soon, you were under arrest. You were brought out of the car, put up against the car, and put in handcuffs. And you were taken to the police station and charged. Soon after that, you started working at the adult bookstore, and you had some more interactions with the police. On February 20th, you talked to the police. You were at the bookstore working. They picked you up. You got in their car, closed the door. There was a glass screen separating the front from the back seat. You were sitting in hard seats. You didn't feel safe. You didn't feel secure. You weren't happy about being in that car. You were afraid. And they started talking to you. They started asking you questions. They started asking about the death of Hae Min Lee. They started asking you about what you knew. They started asking you about what you knew about Adnan Syed, about Adnan Syed's involvement in her death. You said you didn't know. You didn't talk. You didn't tell them anything. You didn't know anything. But they kept asking. They kept prodding. And they started threatening you. They started letting you know what could happen to you. What could happen to you if you didn't cooperate. Now, you know from experience what happens to people who don't cooperate with the police. Your father's been in prison. You have family that's been in prison. People in your neighborhood have been in prison. And you know that prison's not a good place to be. And so you sat in that car. You stayed in that car. You didn't feel like you could just leave. And they kept asking questions. The same questions. Questions about the death of Hae Min Lee. Questions about Adnan Syed's involvement. And you didn't have answers. So they talked louder. They talked faster. They kept going. And pretty soon, you arrived at the police station. The detectives in the car came around. They opened your door. By the way, that door was locked on the inside. You couldn't just open that door. They had to open it for you. And they did. And you got out of the car. One cop in front of you, one behind you, and you walked. And you walked into that station. It was a long walk. It was a scary walk. This was midnight. It was dark. You walked into the police station. You walked past a bunch of cops. It was copland. and you walk to a small room, an interrogation room. The type of interrogation room you see on TV. The walls were thick. The doors were thick. You walked into the room. A detective shut the door. You sit down at a table, a small table. The room couldn't have been more than from this end of the courtroom to halfway that way. It was a glorified phone booth. And you're sitting at one end of a very small table, and two detectives at the other end of the table. Two big detectives. You couldn't hear any sound from outside that room. You couldn't tell, being in that room, what time it was. Could have been any time of the day. And they have a pile of documents. And they start asking you more questions. Again and again about what you know. What you know about Hae Min Lee's death, and what you know about Adnan Syed's involvement. But you didn't tell him anything. Not that time. And they let you go. Till the next day, February 21st. You were at work again, at the adult bookstore, and they came to talk to you again. They came at night. They came in an unmarked car, and they told you to get in the car. They opened the door, you get in the car, and you sit down in a hard seat. There's a glass pane separating you from the front. Doors locked on the inside. You didn't feel safe. You didn't feel happy. You were afraid. You were really afraid. And they started asking you questions. More questions about the death of Hae Min Lee, about what you knew about the death of Hae Min Lee, and about Adnan Syed's involvement. Somewhere around that time, they told you that you were showing up on some cell phone records. You were showing up on Adnan Syed's cell phone records. Some of your friends too. Like your very good friend Jen. And as you're driving in that car, they keep questioning you. Sometime around that time, the threats began about maybe you're involved in the death of Hae Min Lee. And what could happen to a guy who's involved in the death of Hae Min Lee? You also knew then, in the back of your mind, about the arrest just less than a month earlier. As you're sitting in that car and they're asking questions, you're thinking about the arrest. And they keep going. Again, you get to the police station on February 21st. It's dark. It's cold. The car pulls in. Detective gets out. Opens your door. Your door's locked from the inside. You can't get out on your own. One detective in front, one detective's behind. You walk into the police department. You walk past a bunch of cops to a small interrogation room, a glorified telephone booth, and you sit down at a table, a small table. On the other side, detectives. The same story. They ask you more and more questions about Hae Min Lee and about Adnan Syed's involvement. And you don't give them up. You don't tell them. Then, on February 22nd, you're working at the adult bookstore. It's night. It's the night shift. And they come again. Unmarked police car? They tell you to come with them. So you do. You don't feel like you have a choice. They open the door. You get in the car. You sit down. Hard seats. Glass pane separating you from them. Door locked on the inside. Questions. They ask you questions. Questions about the death of Hae Min Lee. Questions about Adnan Syed's involvement. They keep going. And more threats. Threats about what could happen to you if you don't cooperate. That you could be charged with her death. Sometime around then, they mention the death penalty. That you could be charged with the murder and you could get the death penalty. You know about the death penalty. You know that it's something that people could get. You didn't want it. There's a lot more. They keep driving. You get to the police station again. They park. It's dark. It's cold. They come around, open the door, still locked on the inside. One detective in front of you, one detective behind. You walk in. Past a bunch of cops to a small interrogation room. And it starts again. Till the next time, things change. You talk. That was on February 28th. And on February 28th, one moment, Your Honor, I'm going to take a brief break and check my notes. I'm sorry, I did not misspeak. It was February 28th. Excuse me, Your Honor. Thank you for your indulgence. They pick you up again at the adult bookstore. I'm going to scratch that and back up. I'm going to ask you some questions about how your interrogations with the police were being recorded. You understand? We just talked about 3 meetings with the police. And fair to say, there wasn't a tape recorder there. You know what a tape recorder is. There wasn't one there. There wasn't someone jotting down what was said word for word. That didn't happen. They weren't even really taking much in the way of notes. Just a lot of talking. When you arrived at the interrogation on February 28th, there wasn't a tape recorder running. There wasn't someone writing down notes. A tape recorder did start running later, but not at the beginning. Not for 3 hours. They kept asking you questions in those 3 hours. They asked you questions about the death of Hae Min Lee. They asked you questions about Adnan Syed's involvement. You continued to tell them you didn't know who killed her, and you didn't know anything about Adnan being involved. You even suggested maybe other people who could be involved. Suggested they could look at Dawn. They kept asking the same questions. They kept the threats going and the same questions over and over. And somewhere in that 3 hours, you cracked. You told them what they wanted to hear. You told them that Adnan Syed was involved in Hae Min Lee's death. I'm going to ask you some questions about what happened after you did that. You understand? At that time, the tape started running. The tone of the interrogation changed. And I should say, at that February 20th meeting, there were 2 cops there. One was Detective McGillivray. The other was Detective Ritz. There wasn't anyone else in that room other than you. There wasn't anyone else in those rooms during the meetings on February 20th. There wasn't anyone else in that room on the meeting on February 21st. There wasn't anyone else in that room on the meeting of February 22nd. And you'll agree with me that no one else could see what happened in those interrogations other than you and the detectives. We weren't there. There's no recording. We just have to take your word for it and the detective's word for it. I'm going to return to asking you questions about what happened in that February 28th interrogation. You understand? The tape recorder started rolling, and they asked you questions about what happened. These questions were following the story you had told them after you cracked, the story about Adnan Syed's involvement. I'm going to ask you some more questions about what that interrogation room looked like. You understand? On the table, you're on one end, Detective Ritz and McGillivray on the other. They had paper there, a lot of paper there. It had documents, there were records, there were notes. And as they were questioning you, they were looking at those papers. They were noting those papers. They were tapping those papers. And you saw what was on those papers. You read what was on those papers. You used what was on those papers to answer their questions. Fair to say, strike that, scratch it. You've heard what was on the recording from the February 28th interrogation. You've listened to it. And you were at that interrogation. You were the person there. You'll agree with me that a lot of what happened in that interrogation is not captured on that audio recording. It couldn't be captured on the audio recording. They were standing, scratch that. They were across from you the same way that I'm across from you right now. I'm making gestures. You're making gestures. There's nonverbal communication going on. And there certainly was nonverbal communication going on there. They were pointing to things. They were having responses. You were. And nobody who wasn't at that interrogation can understand all that went on. We have to take your word for it, and we have to take their word for it. As this interrogation continued, they asked more questions that followed up what they had asked you in the pre-interview. And they continued to look at paper documents as they went. You continued to look at those documents. They continued to point out things on those documents. You continued to read what they pointed on those documents. And you used those documents to answer their questions. I'm going to ask you some questions about some things that you had to lose in life during these interrogations. You understand? You love Stephanie. You loved Stephanie then. You wanted to spend your life with Stephanie. Stephanie's parents, scratch that. Fair to say, Stephanie's parents thought you were part of the criminal element at Woodlawn High School. They wanted someone different for their daughter. And Stephanie was going to college. And you knew they wanted her to see someone else. You knew that because you and Stephanie talked about it. She told you. And you could tell. If you're in prison, you're going to lose Stephanie. She's not going to hang around for some prisoner to wait to start her life. She's young. She's beautiful. She's smart. It's not going to happen. And you wouldn't want it to happen. You want more for her. If you get locked up, you're losing Stephanie. You love your family. As we talked about, you're the breadwinner in your family. If you're not bringing money in, they're out on the street. You don't want that. You've never wanted it. You do anything to keep your family safe. You break the law to keep your family safe. You cheat to keep your family safe. Sell drugs to keep your family safe. And you lie to keep your family safe. You lie to keep your mom from being kicked out on the street. You lie to keep your grandma from being kicked out on the street. You lie to keep your grandpa from being kicked out on the street. You go to prison, it's over for them. You go to jail, it's over for them. It's over for them even if you're acquitted. Because every day that you're locked up, money isn't going into that household. You don't work, they're not safe. Around the time that you had these interrogations, scratch that. I'm going to ask you some questions about, scratch that. I'm going to ask you some questions about what's happened to you in the criminal justice system since those interrogations with the police. You understand? That January 27th arrest and charge, nothing happened to that. You never spent a night in jail for that. You haven't paid a dime in a fine for that, in restitution for that. It just disappeared. Gone. Haven't heard anything else about it. It's been almost a year. And nothing's going to happen to you because of that. You agree? In this case, you admitted a pretty terrible crime. You said under oath that you covered up Hae Min Lee's murder, that you knew about it beforehand, and you did nothing. You said here that you did nothing to protect her. And when she died, you've said you helped cover it up. You've never spent a night in jail from that. You haven't spent a minute in jail from that. You haven't paid a dime in restitution for that. You don't have a felony on your record as we sit here today. You haven't lost a job because of this. You haven't lost any income because of this. You're still together with Stephanie. She's here in the court today. You're still living in the same house. Your family has food on the table. Your mom's not out on the street. Your grandparents aren't out on the street. You haven't lost your freedom today. I'm going to ask you some questions about your car. You understand? Today, you have a car. You've had a car for a few months. Back in January 1999, you didn't have a car. You were selling pot in January 1999. you were working 2 full-time jobs in January 1999. You were the sole breadwinner in your family in January 1999. You weren't getting money from Stephanie. You weren't getting money from Stephanie's parents. You weren't getting money from your dad, that's for sure. You weren't getting money from any other family source or friends. And you couldn't afford a car in January 1999. You couldn't afford a motorcycle in January 1999. You couldn't afford anything motorized in January 1999. I'm going to ask you some questions about the work you're doing today. You understand? You're not selling pot anymore. That's in your past. You're working 1 full-time job. You're not working at the adult bookstore anymore. Just 1 full-time job. And you have a car. The full-time job you're working at doesn't pay any better than the adult bookstore. Doesn't pay any better than the other job you're working at. Doesn't pay any better than H&M and clothing. It doesn't pay any better than the pot you were selling. You've got a car. You didn't get money from your family to buy the car. Your dad didn't send you money. Your mom didn't give you money. Your grandma didn't give you money. Your grandfather didn't give you money. None of your family gave you money. You didn't get money from Stephanie's parents. You didn't get money from Stephanie. But you'll agree with me, you got a car. I'm going to ask you some questions about Crime Stoppers. You understand? You know what Crime Stoppers is. Anonymous program to help solve crimes. Anonymous. Person calls in, gives information, stays anonymous, might get a reward. Hae Min Lee's disappearance got a lot of attention. Her death, too. It was on TV. It was on the radio. It was in the newspaper. People were talking about it. You were talking about it. Adnan was talking about it. Stephanie was talking about it. Lots of people were talking about it. And there were flyers around. Crime Stoppers flyers. You know Crime Stoppers flyers. Had Hae Min Lee's picture. Had her name. Told you you could call in anonymously. And had money. A reward. And you had an idea how much the reward was. It was about $2,000. You didn't have $2,000 in your bank account in late January 1999. You didn't have $200 in your bank account in late January 1999. I want to ask you some questions about Dawn. You understand? Dawn was Hae Min Lee's boyfriend. You knew this. Adnan knew this. Stephanie knew this. Their friends knew it. Now, you never met Dawn, but you'd heard about Dawn. Adnan had told you about Dawn. Stephanie had told you about Dawn. And Dawn's a little different than you. He didn't grow up in a neighborhood like you. He's never been to your neighborhood. You didn't go to high school with him. He's not the kind of guy you'd have hung out with in high school. And truth be told, you didn't feel very good about Don. And you talked to Adnan about that feeling. You talked to Stephanie about that feeling. And you talked to other people about that feeling. And that is about what I'm going to do for today, people. Because I think it's been, I don't know how. And you knew that the information you provided to police was important. You knew that what you told police could influence the investigation. You knew that if you provided false information, the wrong person could be identified as a suspect. You knew if you provided false information, the wrong person could be charged with Hae Min Lee's murder. And you knew if you provided wrong information, the wrong person could be brought to trial. You knew that if you provided false information, the wrong person could be convicted of this murder. You knew if you provided false information that the wrong person could be sent to prison for this murder. You knew if you provided false information that the wrong person could be sent to prison for life for this murder. You knew that scratch that. You knew that if you provided false information, the person who murdered Hae Min Lee could go free. You knew if you provided false information that Hae Min Lee's family may never get justice. You knew if you provided false information that a killer would be loose. I'm going to ask you some questions about the importance of the truth. You understand? You're not a bad person. You don't want the wrong person to be put away for Hae Min Lee's murder. You don't want the guilty person to get away with Hae Min Lee's murder. Stephanie was friends with Hae Min Lee. You know many other people who were friends with Hae Min Lee. You know that they want to find justice. And you don't want to stand in the way of that. I'm going to ask you some questions about the interrogations that you had with police. You understand? And I'm going to ask specifically about the interrogations before your official police statements. You understand? Your first official police statement was in the evening of February 27th to 28th. You were at the police headquarters, scratch that. You were at the police department. You were in a room with Detective McGillivray. Detective Ritz was there too. You knew that what you said on the record there was going to be the official police statement. You knew that what you said was being recorded. You knew that what you said would be read. You knew that what you said would be relied on by police. You knew that what you said would be relied on by the court. Now I'm going to ask you some questions about the interrogation before your official police statement. You understand? You talked to the police before you went on the record on February 27th to 28th. You talked to the police for several hours before you went on the record on February 27th to February 28th. They told you a lot about what they thought was going on in the case. They told you about how they thought Hae Min Lee died. They told you that they thought Adnan Syed was the killer. They told you about Adnan Syed's cell phone. They told you that they had Adnan Syed's cell phone records. They showed you Adnan's cell phone records. They showed you pictures during the interrogation before your official police statement. One of these pictures was a map. This map was of the area around Woodlawn High School. The map included Lincoln Park. It included Patapsco State Park. And they made notations along that map. You saw the notations. They told you that these marks were of cell phone pings. They showed where cell phone calls were received on January 13th. They told you that they knew you had Adnan's cell phone on January 13th. They told you that if you didn't cooperate, you could be charged with murder. They told you you could be charged with Hae Min Lee's murder. You could be convicted of Hae Min Lee's murder, and you could get the death penalty if you didn't cooperate. They told you this before your official police statement on February 27th to the 28th. You were scared during this interrogation. You were scared every hour of the interrogation. You were scared every minute of the interrogation. You were scared every second of the interrogation. You didn't want to be charged with the murder of Hae Min Lee. You didn't want to be convicted. You didn't want to be sent to prison. And you didn't want to get the death penalty. The interrogation went on for about 3 hours. And then you told them that you'd tell them what they wanted. And it was then that your official police statement began. You made another official police statement. That was on March 5th. Before this official police statement, you had another interrogation. That interrogation was by the police. It was in an interrogation room. It was right before your official police statement. It was not on the record. They talked to you. You talked to them. They showed you documents. They showed you pictures. They pointed out some problems with your official police statement from February 27th to February 28th. They told you some things were wrong with your statement. And they talked to you for more than an hour. And then you went on the record for your second official police statement. You knew that you were on the record. You knew that what you were saying was being recorded. You knew that it would be relied on by police. You knew that it would be relied on by the court. You had a third official police statement. That was on March 18th. You had an interrogation before your third official police statement. An interrogation was in the interrogation room. Detective Ritz was there. Detective McGillivray was there. They talked to you about what you'd said in your second official police statement. They told you there were some problems with your second official police statement. They showed you some documents. They showed you some pictures. And they told you some things were wrong with your second official police statement. They talked to you about it. You talked to them. And then you went on the record for your third official police statement. And in that third official police statement, you made some changes to your testimony from the first two. I'm going to ask you some questions about what you said in those official police statements. You understand? First, I'm going to ask you about what you said about what Adnan told you about killing Hae Min Lee. We'll begin there. Excuse me, Your Honor. I'm going to approach and write down on the board. No, Mr. Urich, this is well within the rules of evidence, and no, Your Honor, I will not assume that the prosecutor's office understands the rules of evidence based on his conduct in this case. In your first official police statement, the detectives asked you about what Adnan had told you about Hae Min Lee's murder on January 13th. You understand? They asked you if he had told you about her murder before he committed it. You understand? You told him he had. And you told him that he told you on January 13th. Well, that blocky didn't work. Now, you also talked about what Adnan told you about Hae Min Lee's murder in your second official police interview. You told them that he had told you that he was going to kill Hae Min Lee on January 12th. That would be one day before her disappearance. During your second official police statement, the detectives asked you how many times Adnan had told you he was going to kill Hae Min Lee. You said a lot. In your second official police statement, detectives asked you again how many days before Hae Min Lee's disappearance Adnan told you he was going to kill Hae Min Lee. You told them 4 to 5 days. That was in the same second official police interview. I'm going to ask you some questions about what you told police about where Hae Min Lee was murdered. You understand. They asked you in your first official police statement where Hae Min Lee was murdered. You answered. You told them Edmondson Avenue. The detectives asked you about where Hae Min Lee was murdered in your second official police statement. You answered the question. You told them that she was murdered at the parking lot at Best Buy. Now, You had your third official police interview on March 18th. At your third official police interview, the detectives asked you where Hae Min Lee was killed. You answered. You told them that Hae Min Lee was killed at Patapsco, and I may be getting that wrong, State Park. Even though I'm getting the name wrong, you know where I'm talking about. Okay, we'll just call it P Park. But you told them that she was murdered in that park. I apologize, Your Honor, for the time. I'm having some technical difficulties. The whiteboard was not available. When Mr. Urick was questioning you today, he also asked you about where Hae Min Lee was murdered. You answered. You told him she was murdered at Best Buy. I'm going to ask you some questions about what you said in your official police statements about Jen on January 13th. You understand? Now, Jen is a friend of yours. She's a very good friend of yours. You told police in your official police statements that you had hung out with Jen on January 13th. You told them that you'd been at her house on January 13th. I'm going to ask you some questions about what you did with Jen on January 13th. You understand? In your first official police statement, you said that you were at Jen's house around 1 p.m. and you stayed there till about 3:40. The detectives asked you what happened at 3:40. You answered. You said that you got a call from Adnan. And that's what you said in your first official police statement. 3:40. The detectives asked you what you did with Jan on January 13th in your second official police statement. You understand? You answered. You told them that you were with Jen till 3:30 on January 13th. They asked you what happened at 3:30 on January 13th. You told them that you got a call from Adnan. You told them that the call from Adnan was to come and get him. You told them that the call from Adnan was to come and get him because he had Hae Min Lee's body. You talked to police about what you did with Jen on January 13th in your third official police statement. They asked you what you did with Jen on January 13th. You answered. You told them that you were at Jen's house till about 3:40. When Mr. Urich was asking you questions, he asked you about what you did with Jen on January 13th. You answered. You told him that you were with Jen till about 3:45. He asked you what happened at 3:45 p.m. You told him that you got a call from Adnan. And you told him that Adnan had called you from Best Buy. And he told you that he had Hae Min Lee's body. So fair to say that every time you've made an official police statement, you told them that you were with Jen till 3:30, 3:45. And when you spoke today under oath, you told them, scratch that. When you talked to the jury under oath about January 13th, you told them that you were with Jen till about 3:45. I'm going to ask you some questions about what we're going to call P Park. You understand? You talked to police about P Park. You talked about the park in your first official police statement. You told them that you had gone with Adnan to P Park on January 13th. You told them that you were with Adnan at P Park on January 13th for about 35 minutes. You told them you were there from 4:35 to 5:05. You talked to police about P Park in your second official police statement. You told them you had gone there with Adnan on January 13th. You told them you were there for about 20 minutes. You told them you were there from 4:30 to 4:50. You talked to police about going to P Park in your third official police statement. They asked you about going there. You answered. You told them you had. You told them you went there with Adnan. You told them you went there with Adnan on January 13th. You told them you went there with Adnan at 2:15 p.m. Your Honor, I'd like to show the witness something. It's identified Defense Exhibit 1. You recognize this document. This is your official police statement. This is your third official police statement. When you made your third official police statement, what you said was written down, and it later was printed out. You've seen this official police statement in writing. It's accurate. It's what you said. It's what you heard. It's what the detective said. And when you made your official police statement, you knew that what you said would be relied on. You knew that what you said could influence the investigation. You knew that what you said could determine whether an innocent man would be charged. You knew that what you said could determine whether the guilty would go free. I'm going to ask you some questions about page 2, lines 4 to 5 of your third official police statement. You understand? At page 2, lines 3 to 5, you state, I was at Patapsco State Park at 2:15. When you spoke with Mr. Urich today, he asked you about what you did on January 13th. You told him a lot of things. You didn't say that you went to P Park on January 13th. In your official police statements, the detectives asked you questions about Adnan's track practice on January 13th. Scratch that. I'm going to ask you some questions about what you said to police about Adnan's track practice on January 13th. You understand? In your official police statements, you talked about Adnan's track practice on January 13th. And you talked about Adnan's track practice on January 13th in your first official police statement. The detectives asked you about his track practice, and you told them. You told them that you picked him up from track practice on January 13th. You told them that you picked him up from track practice in his own car on January 13th. And you told them, that you picked him up from track practice in his own car at 4:30 p.m. You talked about Adnan Syed's track practice in your second official police interview. The detectives asked you about his track practice, and you answered. You told him you had picked him up from track practice on January 13th, and you told him that you picked him up in his car, and you told him you told them that you picked Adnan up at 5:10 p.m. on January 13th. I'm going to ask you some questions about what you said about Adnan's track practice when Mr. Yurk was questioning you today. You understand. He asked you about Adnan Syed's track practice. You told him that you picked him up from it on January 13th. You picked him up in his own car. And you told him you picked him up at 5:15 p.m. I'm going to ask you some questions about the burial of Hae-Min Lee on January 13th. You understand? In your first official police interview, the detectives asked you about Hae-Min Lee's burial. And you told them about Hae-Min Lee's burial. You knew that what you told them would be relied on by police. What you told them would be relied on by the court. What you told them would be relied on by the jury. And what you told them could determine whether an innocent man was convicted, could determine whether a guilty man went free. So they asked you about Hae-Min Lee's burial, and you answered. You told them that she was buried. You told them that you were there for the burial. You told them only Adnan dug the grave. They asked you, scratch that, in your first official police statement, the detectives asked you how the grave was dug. You answered. You told them that it was dug with a shovel. You told them it was dug with one shovel. In your second official police statement, you were asked again about Hae-Min Lee's burial. You answered. You told them that she was buried. You told them you were there. And you told them that Adnan and you both buried her. The detectives asked you how you buried her. You told them with a shovel. You told them with two shovels. I'm going to ask you some questions. Scratch that. I'm going to ask you some questions about your truthfulness in your official police statements. You understand? In in all three of your official police statements, you were asked if you were telling the truth. You answered. You told them in all three that you were telling the truth. I'm going to ask you some questions about what you told police about Adnan threatening you. You understand? In your first official police interview, you were asked about threats by Adnan. You answered. You told them that Adnan had threatened you. You told them that he had threatened you by talking about a West Side killer. You told him, scratch that, let me rephrase that. You told them that Adnan had threatened you by mentioning a West Side hitman. You were asked about threats from Adnan in your second official police statement. You never said anything about a West Side hitman. You were asked about threats from Adnan in your third official police statement. You never said anything about a West Side hitman. And you were asked about threats from Adnan by Mr. Urich today. You never said anything about a West Side hitman. I'm going to ask you some questions about your plea deal. You understand? You made an agreement with Mr. Urich over here. You agreed to testify here in court, and Mr. Urich agreed to do something in return for you testifying. You signed a plea agreement. He signed a plea agreement. You agreed to some things. he agreed to some things. That's why you're here today. That's why you're not on trial here today. That's why you're not sitting over there with Adnan today. I'm going to ask you some questions about what that plea agreement was. You understand? Your Honor, I would like to show something to the witness. It's Defense Exhibit 2. You recognize this. You've read this before. This is your official plea agreement. This is what you signed. This is what Mr. Urich signed. This is the agreement. That's why you're here today. This agreement decides where you're going in life. This agreement decides whether you're going to go free or whether you're going to go to prison. I'm going to ask you some questions about what the plea agreement says. You understand? I'm going to ask you to read lines 2 to 3 of page 1. Lines 2 to 3 of page 1 say, the defendant represents that he, she, has fully and truthfully responded to all questions put to defendant by law enforcement authorities during all prior interviews. You lied in your official police statements. You lied in your police interviews. You lied repeatedly. You lied about when Adnan supposedly told you about Hae Min Lee's murder. You lied about what you were doing with Jen on January 13th. You lied about P. Park on January 13th. You lied about track practice on January 13th. You lied about the burial on January 13th. And you lied about Anand's threats on January 13th. I'm going to ask you to read the next 2 lines of that page. You understand? It says, if at any point it becomes evident the defendant has not been truthful concerning his involvement in this incident, the state is immediately released from any obligation under this agreement. The agreement becomes null and void, and the state is free to bring any charge against the defendant supported by the evidence. You knew what this said when you signed the agreement. You know what it says today. If Mr. Urich doesn't like what you say here, he can charge you with murder. You understand that? You'll agree that you've admitted today that you've lied. You've lied repeatedly. You've lied about different things. You've lied all along the way. And you believe, as you sit here today, that Mr. Urich can renege on this agreement. He can call it null and void. And he can charge you with any crime he thinks fits the evidence. You believe that. You're scared today. You've been scared a long time. You're scared of being charged with a crime you didn't commit. You're scared of being convicted of a crime you didn't commit. And you're scared of going away for a crime you didn't commit. One moment, Your Honor. Those are all the questions I'm going to have at this time, and we'll resume cross-examination tomorrow. All right, so that's what I've had. It's a little slow, and it's only part of what we would do at trial. But I hope it gives an idea of one way to show for a jury what these inconsistent statements mean. If you saw part one of my cross-examination last week, okay, someone has a lot of comments, and actually they're interesting, so I'd be very interested to talk to you more about it. I don't know if the person commenting had seen part one, and maybe you could watch that. It's on YouTube, on my YouTube channel, part one of the cross-examination, and see if that's the case, because what I identified in part one is I laid out the background of Jay, that he's the sole breadwinner in this family, that he has everything to lose in this case, and he has had a bad experience with the police, and he believed that, that he could be put away. So what I laid out in part one was why he lied, that he had so much on the line, and I tried to come into more specifics here about how that played out. And there's a lot more, of course, but the idea being is I want the jury to see that Jay's not lying because he's a bad person. He's not lying because he murdered Hae Min Lee. He's lying because he really believes that if he doesn't do what the police want, he's going to be in a world of hurt. So in terms of theory of the case is that there's this police rush to judgment against Adnan, and as part of that theory of the case, and maybe we will, I've done some cross-examination of Don, and certainly the cross-examination of the detectives. And also, if you look on my YouTube channel, there's Adnan Syed playlist, and I do have a mock cross-examination of Detective McGillivray. And in that, I lay out a little bit more about the interrogations and about how faulty they were and how the information doesn't come across. And in part two, what I would do is, having laid this out, I would play out more of the rush to judgment. Was any of what I said used in any way by Christina Gutierrez? If you go to YouTube, I don't know my YouTube ID, but if you put in Brendan Kenny on YouTube and put in Adnan Syed, it should come up. And also, I'm on Twitter. Here's what we can do. I'm on Twitter. Sorry, just a minute. Sorry, people. On Twitter at Kenny Brendan. My Twitter and Periscope handle is Kenny Brendan. Kenny. There we go. Brendan. Yeah, Kenny Brendan. The @ that's on Twitter and Periscope. And so that's a good way you can follow me there. You can follow me there, and you can you should get updates on what I'm doing. And I think the information I gave you is enough to find me on YouTube. And I've also been tweeting about my playlist. So I also have a short mock cross-examination of Don months ago, which I lay out the rush to judgment when it comes to Adnan. So, but again, I'm totally open to criticism. This is not perfect, and I didn't spend as much time as I wanted to do on this at all. And I would love to hear any criticism from people, constructive or otherwise, because the thank you. Someone put what it is. Oh, that's Kathy from Court Chatter. Thank you so much for sharing that too. And I'd be happy to hear it. And just so you know kind of where I'm coming from in cross-examination technique, I do write articles for the Lawyerist blog. So if you put in Lawyerist Brendan Kenny author, it'll come up and you'll see under cross-examination what I do. And the idea, criticism's fine, because look, if you're especially a layperson, someone, a potential juror, and you think what I'm doing doesn't make sense, it doesn't make sense. I'm not on the real case. I'm just doing this for fun. I'm a civil defense lawyer in the Twin Cities, so this isn't really even my bailiwick, but I love cross-examination, and it's a great opportunity to speak to people who are potential jurors. So any feedback you have, this is like a mock trial, in a small sense. So I really welcome it. It's really important. It's really huge. I was going somewhere here. So the theory of the case, yeah. If the theory of the case is that Jay lied because he's trying to, how should I say it? He's trying to get the heat off. And yeah, I'd love to hear any thoughts. So I'm going to continue doing these cross-examinations, and I'm going to keep going with it. And if you like it, you can be on here and feel free to share, and we'll go from there. That's a rhyme. I got to end for tonight. I'm going to end with a song that doesn't seem like a song that would be related to Jay, but it's one that, for some reason, it's an Irish folk song, but for some reason when I listen to it, it makes me think of Jay. So we'll end with that. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you for being here, for sticking around. Thank you for the support, sharing this, following me on Twitter, the hearts. It's a big deal. This is stuff I think about all the time. I'm, doing in my own mind. So to be able to actually practice it is great. And thanks for Kathy at Court Chatter. It's wonderful. All right. So I will play the song. We'll get out of here. Thanks again. Sorry, I'm having trouble with it, but it'll be here in a second. I think you guys will like it. There we go. By Paul Brady, Nothing But the Same Old Story. It's about the Irish in England in the 60s. So the whole deal with the police and all that stuff. All right.
watching them break up. Every time some bored brain puts us down, making jokes on the radio. I guess it helps them all round out the sound, the crumbling foundations. Any fool can see the writings on the wall, but they just don't believe that it's happening. No, no. Well, there's a crowd says I'm alright. City light might turn to praise. Take me around to the parties. Oh, I can dress a monkey in a cage and play my parties. Oh, but when the wine is to the side, it's nothing but the same old story. Oh, it's nothing but the same old story. Say, hey, Johnny, can't wait for Saturday night. First is raging. A little place where we can put that right, wash away the frustration. Holds down this fire inside, but look out. Yeah. I said, look out, 'cause I'll tell you when the pieces that you cross me. I got a brother in Boston. Says he'd send me on the bird. Just wrote me a letter, making out that he's cleaning up all the 2 cars in the driveway. Summer house way down in the Cape, and I know it picks me up in the morning. Well, I've been thinking about it, but it seems so far to go. People say in the winter you get lost underneath the snow. And this is Gerald from my home place. But we've been planning to move back and give it a try. So I never got around to go out. That's why I never got around to go out. So hey, Johnny, can't wait for Saturday night. Got a thirst this raging. A little place where we can forget right, wash away the confusion. Holds down this fire inside, but look out. Look out. Look out. Don't come too close. Not too close.
Buddy who stuck around. Have a good night. See you around.